If you've been following along so far, you should have a folder on your computer called Digital Name Tag, and it should contain the video file with your self-introduction as well as the CVGS Griffin graphic found in the Google Classroom. With those two pieces of media in hand, we can jump into Adobe Premiere itself. Upon opening Adobe Premiere, you're given the option to open an existing project or start a new one. Selecting New Project will take you to a screen where you can enter a name for the project, set a location where the project file will be saved on your computer, and start selecting media to import into the project. I'll go ahead and name my project using my last name, first initial, and the assignment name, and I'll set it to be saved in my Digital Name Tag folder. I usually wait to import media until after I've created the project, but I'm not always working with projects this straightforward. Anything you select from this menu will get added to an editing timeline when you hit Create, which may be just fine for some projects. I tend to do a little work before I start adding files to the timeline, as you'll see, but that's just my preference. If you want to import your files from here, you can find the correct folder from this screen, navigating it like you would File Explorer, and preview the files before selecting them. By holding the cursor over the video's thumbnail, you can drag it back and forth to scan through the footage and make sure it's the right file. Though, if you've taken my advice and gone in and renamed your files, it shouldn't be a problem. Then, for each of the files that you want to import, you can click the checkbox in the top left corner. I can quickly select consecutive files by selecting the first one, holding Shift, and then selecting the last file. You can also select or deselect individual files by holding the Control key and clicking the file or files in question. To select all the files within a folder, you can open the folder and hit Control A, or you can back out of that folder and then just select the folder itself from the menu. You can add multiple folders this way as well. When you click Create, Premiere will load up the workspace, which you can see is divided into several distinct panel groups or tab groups. For the purposes of introducing you to the workspace, I'll be referring to each of these areas by the name of its primary panel. They're generally the ones you'll use most anyway. Now, if at any point you're following along and your screen doesn't look quite like mine, you should check and make sure we're using the same workspace preset. Along the top of the application window, you'll find the menu bar, which is where you find options like File, Edit, Clip, and so on. One of these is labeled Window. Holding your cursor over it will reveal a drop-down that starts with the word Workspaces and an arrow on the side. If you hover over Workspaces, you'll see another drop-down that lists Premiere's available workspace presets. Each of these presets can be thought of as a set of preferences that tailor Premiere's layout to suit specific post-production work. I tend to use the preset titled Editing, but if at any point I switch over to another one, I'll make sure to let you know. Even then, all the tabs I'll mention can be found in the original Window dropdown. Rather than just describe each area in isolation, I'll demonstrate the basics of each of them using my self-introduction clip. First, I'll need to import it, since I chose not to have it automatically loaded into the project. Like many things in Premiere, there's several ways to go about that. I could go to the menu bar, select File, Import, then find the right folder and file. I could select Import just below the menu bar and return to the menu we saw when creating the project. There's also my go-to, which is to pull the folder up in File Explorer, select my files, and drag and drop them into the bottom left panel, which I'll be referring to as the Project panel. I've already brought up the subject of organizing files a couple of times in previous videos, and there are options to do the same within the Project panel itself. You'll see an icon shaped like a folder, and if you hover your cursor over it, you'll see it's labeled New Bin. I don't know the precise reason they're called bins in Premiere, when they seem to be folders for all intents and purposes. Possibly it's a holdover from olden times, like how film editors used to actually cut and paste film strips. They might be called bins as a nod to a way film and videotape used to be stored. Regardless, bins are folders, and you can click and drag items into these bins to organize them. Next to the new bin icon is an icon that resembles a piece of paper with a folded corner, which is listed as New Item. Clicking New Item will open a list of items that can be created. Some of these may come up in later guides, but for now, I need to create a sequence in which to do my editing. To keep things simple, we'll stick to this first tab of the New Sequence window. My self-introduction was shot in full HD, 1920 by 1080, and at 30 frames per second. I want the sequence to match that, so I'll go to the folder marked 1080, select the preset that matches my frame rate, give the sequence a name, last name, first initial, etc., and hit OK. You'll notice that this menu doesn't actually list 24 and 30 FPS. Instead, you see options like 23.976 and 29.97. Feel free to look up the technical, historical reason for these not being quite even, but it's not really relevant to what we're doing right now. Just know that 23.976 FPS can be treated as 24, and 29.97 can be treated as 30. You can also create a new sequence based on a specific clip in the project panel by right-clicking it and selecting New Sequence from Clip. I still choose to go through the New Sequence menu to ensure I've got the right settings, because if you've accidentally shot something at a higher resolution and used the Sequence from Clip feature, it could lead to confusion later on when you try to bring in 1080 clips and find they don't fit the frame like expected. These sequences are displayed in the Timeline panel, which we'll get to in a bit. The project panel can display your files a few different ways. To demonstrate, I'll make this panel a bit bigger. I'll hold my cursor over the boundaries between adjacent panels, where it'll change to a pair of opposing black arrows. Then, I can click and drag to adjust their relative proportions. You can also move individual tabs, even make them their own panels by clicking and dragging them. If you accidentally close a tab and want to call it up again, you can select Window from the menu bar and select the tab from the drop-down. If you ever want to reset your panel layout, just go up to Window, select Workspaces, and Reset to Saved Layout. Back to the different file display methods. The first, which you're seeing now, is the list view. It displays the names of files and other information like frame rate, duration, and in and out points. Other views can be accessed using the icons in the bottom left of the project panel. Next to List View is Icon View, which also displays the files, but with a proper thumbnail that you can scan through like you can do in the Import menu. Freeform View may look identical to Icon View at first glance, but what distinguishes it is the ability to click and drag files around and arrange them like you might do with notes on a bulletin board. It should be noted before we get too far from the subject of importing files. The files that you import into a Premiere project like this are still tied to the original files wherever they exist on your device. They're not duplicated. That means if you move one of those files to another location on your computer, you delete one of those files, or in the case of using an external drive, you disconnect the storage device, Premiere will replace it in your project with a filler graphic that reads Media Offline. If this happens, a window should pop up listing the media and its last known location. If that window doesn't pop up, right-click on the file in the project folder and select Link Media. From there, click Locate and navigate through your folders to find the file again. By clicking on one of my files in the project panel, a preview will appear in the panel above, the source panel. The Griffin graphic is just an image, so there's not much to do with it in the source panel. You'll see that the source panel has its own little timeline, which I can use to place markers and set in and out points. Markers are a convenient way to make note of key points in a video clip. In my sample video, I timed my edit in order to have the first transition end before I started introducing myself, which I then mirrored for the second transition. By clicking and dragging the little blue pointer above the timeline, I can scan through the video and pinpoint the moments where I start and stop talking down to the very frame. To watch through the video, I could hit the little play button or press the space bar while the source panel is highlighted. Notice the blue box around it. You'll always want to be aware of which panel is active if you use a lot of keyboard shortcuts, because some of them are context sensitive, performing certain functions only when a certain panel is highlighted. On both ends of this mini timeline, you'll see a set of numbers, one blue and one gray. The gray numbers indicate the duration of the clip being previewed. The blue numbers are the current timecode, which is synced to the blue pointer, also known as a timeline indicator. Timecodes can be used to reference exact points in a video. The numbers represent the current number of hours, minutes, seconds, and frames since the start of the video. My video was shot at 30 FPS, so if I moved the indicator to a point 5.5 seconds in, the timecode would read 00000515. If I shot my video at 24 FPS, the 5.5 seconds in would be the same except for a 12 where the 15 was, since 12 is half of 24. Let me find the point where I start talking. I can eyeball it by clicking and dragging the indicator with the mouse, or I can move frame by frame by pressing either the left or right arrow keys. With the indicator at the right spot, I can either click on the first of these icons along the bottom of the panel, or I can hit M on my keyboard to place a marker. I'll do the same at the point where I stop talking.
As well as the Central Virginia Governor's School for Science and Technology.
To move the indicator back to a specific marker, all I have to do is click on that marker. Markers can be deleted by double-clicking on them and selecting Delete from the window that appears. These markers will carry over to the timeline when I add this clip to my sequence. I could trim the ends of my video down in the timeline panel, but I can also do some of that prep work in the source panel. I'll go to my first marker and click on the blue timecode. In the window that appears, I can then type a new timecode and hit Enter, which will move the indicator to that point. I don't even need to worry about all the zeros and colons. Going back to my example from earlier, if my first marker is set at 5 seconds and 12 frames, which I could enter as 512, I can simply type 412 to have the indicator jump back to 4 seconds and 12 frames exactly. I could place another marker and use that as a reference point when trimming it down in the timeline panel. Or I could hit the left bracket icon, or I, to set an in point, and then hit either the right bracket or O to set an out point. In fact, I'll do both. I can then click and drag from the image itself in the source panel and add it to the timeline panel. If I zoom in on the timeline by clicking and dragging the bottom scroll bar, you'll see that all that got carried over was the section of video highlighted between the in and out points. If you do a bunch of takes in a single video clip, or you only want to pull highlights from a longer video, the source panel's in and out point feature is a good way to avoid all the clutter of adding a large clip to the timeline, snipping out individual sections, and then deleting the rest piece by piece. By default, sequences in the timeline panel are made up of 3 video tracks and 3 audio tracks. hence Premiere being known as a multi-track editor. Because I was only able to highlight and trim a section from a single clip at a time in the source panel, that panel could be thought of as a single track editor of sorts, meaning you can't layer files over top of each other in there like you can in the timeline. There are options to toggle the visibility of individual video tracks, as well as mute individual audio tracks, but we only need to concern ourselves with the first of each track for this assignment. Like the source panel, the timeline panel has a blue indicator that moves as the sequence plays and which you can drag around to preview specific points in the sequence. Unlike the source panel, the timeline preview is displayed in a separate panel, the program panel. The program panel has a set of icons like the source panel, and they correspond to similar functions. If you're not sure what one of them does, just hold your mouse over it for a second and its function will be displayed. To move and edit clips within the timeline panel, it's sometimes necessary to swap to a different tool. The toolbar is typically found squished between the project and timeline panels. The active tool is highlighted in blue, which by default should be the selection tool, represented by a cursor icon. In addition to moving clips around the timeline by clicking and dragging them, the selection tool can be used to trim clips by clicking and dragging the ends of them. If you've got markers on a clip, you should see the edge of that clip snap to that point if you pull one end in close to it. If you don't see that happening, you'll want to look for the magnet-shaped icon in the timeline panel, which corresponds to the Snap in Timeline function, and make sure it's active, or blue. This is a very handy feature. That second pair of markers I placed on the clip can now be used as guides should I want to trim or extend the clip back to the duration I previously set with the in and out points. Below the selection tool is a small razor, which represents the razor tool. As you might guess, the razor tool is used to slice clips up, which you do by holding your cursor over a clip and left-clicking. With the Snap in Timeline function active, the razor will snap to a marker if one's nearby, which can help with precise cuts. Next is the Hand tool. It can be used to scroll along the timeline as well as slide around within the frame. You'll see that I can actually magnify my sequence preview in the program panel by selecting a percentage from the drop-down next to the panel's own blue timecode. The last tool of this set you'll want to know for this lab are the Type and the Pen tool. With the Type tool selected, you can click a spot within the frame to place an editable text graphic. With the Pen tool, you can click within the frame and draw shapes that can be used to control different effects. We'll come back to the Type tool and the Pen tool in later assignments, but I thought I'd go ahead and point them out. If you're a fan of keyboard shortcuts, you can press T when the timeline panel is active to switch to the Type tool, P for the Pen tool, H for the Hand tool, C for the razor tool, like cut, and V for the selection tool, V for selection. I guess they didn't want it getting mixed up with the save function.